All right, thank you everyone so much for coming. We're very excited today to have the first of our historic process demonstration series. This is a brand new series that we're introducing. We are currently unable to do historic process workshops at the museum, but we wanted to provide people with a look inside what happens in our workshops and kind of give you a taste of what you could learn and also what our process historians are working on at the moment. This series was made possible thanks to two grants. The first is Art Bridges, and the second is the National Endowment for the Humanities. Without these two grants, we wouldn't be able to bring you these presentations, so we're very grateful for the support that they give us. This is also possible because of the support of members and donors. So if you're not a current member or donor, we invite you to join us and support what we're doing, especially during these challenging times. The support of our members and donors means a lot. A couple quick things about using Zoom today. We will not be taking any live questions. However, you can use the Q&A function in Zoom. It should be at the bottom of your screen if you're using a desktop. And so you can use that Q&A function to ask any questions, and we'll address those at the end of the presentation. If you're having any technical issues or you just want to say hi or share a story, you can also use our chat function, which we'll be using throughout this. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to process historian Mark Osterman, who's going to be talking to us today about clouds and combination printing.
Hi there, it's Mark Osterman. I'm the process historian at George Eastman Museum. I've been here now for 21 years, digging into the books and looking at the collections. If you've never been here, you've got to come and see what we have. Because we can't do hands-on workshops, I was asked to come up with something interesting to talk about in regards to process. I'm a process historian, so you would think I would know something interesting about process. And really what I wanted to do is to give a demonstration on how to cook Amish scrapple or change a tire for a Model T Ford. But my colleagues said, you can't do that. You've got to zero in on photography. And so here I am. And the reason why clouds and combination printing, we have an exhibit up right now on clouds, photographing clouds. I guess I have to start with why clouds seem to not photograph. If you look at photographs from the 19th century, you'll notice that there are clouds that are missing. They're conspicuous by their absence. And so they're blank skies for probably 98% of all the 19th century landscape photographs you've ever seen. It's not that they didn't have clouds back then. They had plenty of clouds. It just has to do with how they photograph. So before I get into that, what I really need to talk about is how photography works in the days of cloudless skies. The first thing we need to address is the sensitivity of the photographic product. And actually, I have a slide here. If you could bring up the first slide. The first thing I want to show you is that when you look at the wavelengths that are available, which means anything from gamma to radio and television waves, gamma waves, all sorts of waves. The area that humans can see is actually incredibly narrow. And so if you look at this illustration, you can see where there's a segment right next to infrared and ultraviolet. You can see ultraviolet on the left and infrared on the right. And that little sliver has been opened up into the illustration below that shows the larger wavelengths that we can see. We can see everything from kind of a violet color through blue, green, yellow, orange, and then into red. But here's the rub. When you make a photosensitive material it will only be sensitive to blue and violet. It will be sensitive to ultraviolet, but we can't see that, so that doesn't really count. It will be sensitive to blue and violet. And they had a term for this in the 19th century. They called it actinic light. So actinic light is the blue and violet light that will tickle the electrons in photosensitive materials to make a change. And throughout the 19th century, up until around the 1880s, most photosensitive materials were only sensitive to blue and violet. So we call them just blue sensitive or actinic colors. So it's not just the color, it's also the light, color and light. And as it turns out, the warm colors don't photograph very well. So if we could bring up the next slide, here's an illustration. My wife and I took this picture in 1995 using Kodak Gold color print film. It's the popular film of the day. And I want you to notice that in the still life, things have been chosen very carefully. What we have are some fruit and vegetables. There's a blue vase, there's an apple, an orange, a lemon, a tomato, ears of corn. There are also roses of different colors. And there's a tablecloth. Now, the tablecloth was chosen as a metaphor for sky and clouds. Hopefully you can see this on your screen, that there is a very light blue background with white patterns. And that would be, our sky and cloud. Along with that, you also see the warm colors. Now, I'm going to go to the next slide. And that is the way that very same scene photographs as a wet collodion negative and then made into an albumin print. Look at where the blue cloth was. Now you can see that it's not so much that clouds don't photograph. It's just that the blue photographs the same value as the white clouds. Also look at the tomato, the orange, the apple, and the lemon. When you try to photograph warm colors, all that you will find when you shoot with a daguerreotype or calotype paper negative or albumin on glass negative or wet collodion or dry collodion, all of the processes up to about 1880s, all that you will get will be the specular highlight, so the reflection of light off those objects. When you look at, say, I think that's the tomato in the center. The tomato in the center, the color does not photograph, but just that little shiny part. This still life, by the way, was set up on our porch, so it was taken outside. And what you're seeing is actually the blue sky reflecting off the surface of the red tomato. And the same thing goes for the lemon. And the lemon actually shows some detail because it has a texture. It also works this way with the leaves. When you photograph a tree that has green leaves that are shiny, you're not actually photographing the green of the leaf. You're photographing the upturned leaf that's reflecting blue sky. And if you photograph enough leaves that are reflecting blue sky, you get the impression that you have photographed a green tree. Given how many things these old plates are insensitive to, it's a miracle we don't really notice that it's missing some things. On the other hand, look at the blue vase. Can you go back to the first slide, please? There we go. Look at the blue vase. The blue vase and the blue tablecloth. Go to the next slide, and you'll see that the blue vase appears clear. The same thing happens when you're photographing people. If you have a person with blue eyes, the blue of their eye photographs as white. There was a little bit of a surprise in this. Well, first of all, bananas are yellow, but the banana didn't photograph as dark as the lemon. That's because it's a cool yellow. There's some blue in there. But what was really a surprise were the roses. If you look at the roses, let's go back to the color image again. If you look at the roses, our assumption was that the reddish rose was going to photograph dark, and the whitish rose was going to photograph light. Go to the next slide again. And it's exactly the opposite. And as we thought about that, what we came to realize is that the red rose wasn't really red. It was a pink rose. It was a cool red. And the white rose wasn't really white. It was more of an ivory color, so it had some yellow. It takes a lot to figure out, to predetermine how things will photograph with these old processes. And so there are some things you can be guaranteed that you'll see. We can go back to live picture. There I am. One thing is, if you're photographing someone who has red hair, well, remember what happened with the tomato and the orange. The red will photograph black. So people with bright red hair will photograph with black hair. If you're wearing a bright red dress, it'll photograph as a black dress. Years ago, we did a series of tests for people that were historians of clothing, because often they would say, this person is in mourning clothes. The clothes are black, so obviously they're in mourning. You can't go by that. You would have to actually go by the styling of the clothes, because a person could be wearing a bright orange dress and it would photograph as black. If a person has freckles, they photograph black. Everything you hate about your face photographs as black. And so if you have blemishes, if you have pimples, if you have dark circles under your eyes, again, anything you don't like, age spots, they're going to photograph as black. And so this ushers in a whole new school of manipulating photographs. So when it comes to making a negative, you can actually go into the negative and apply density. Where a freckle would be clear on the negative, you could apply density and fill it in, and that way people don't have to have freckles. You can change it. And so anything you don't like about yourself, the photographer would know right away what you're not going to like in that photograph. And so if you went in for a daguerreotype or an ambrotype where you don't really do any retouching, and somebody comes in with a darker hue of their skin or reddish hue, maybe your studio was on the top floor of a 5-story building. By the time you walked up to that studio, it's possible that you were huffing and puffing and your cheeks were red. The smart photographer would say, have a seat. How about a cup of tea? Anything they could to get that red down. If they didn't have a choice, the early photographers actually applied makeup, a powder. Same thing was done in the early days of television, where they would actually put blue powder on people's skin just to make it photograph lighter. And forget it if you're a person of color. I mean, a person of color, if you had darkish brown skin or reddish skin, remember the specular highlight off of the tomato and the apple. Your face is going to look like polished ebony, except for the shiny spots. The only way to get around that was to actually shoot pictures of people with dark skin against a dark background. And by doing that, they could lighten up the look of the skin. So when it comes to blue sensitivity and clouds, again, it's not that clouds don't photograph in the 19th century. It's that the blue sky photographs too well. And so the best way you can predetermine this or to visualize this is get yourself a blue filter. This is 2 pieces of glass that are surrounding a very thin theater gel that's blue. And if you hold this up to your eye and just start looking around, don't drive with it. And look at everything in your life, and you'll start to notice that when you look at blue things, they appear lighter through the blue filter. When you look at red, orange, brown, they appear darker. So, so how do you get clouds in photographs? Well, they had some photographs that have clouds. I guess probably the most famous ones are the ones by Legray, the seascapes that show clouds. And every once in a while you see other clouds. Carlton Watkins clouds. George Bernard in the American Civil War had the same clouds in several photographs. How do you make clouds appear? Well, it's a blue sensitive film, so if you try to make an exposure of the landscape, which is predominantly green, which doesn't photograph that well, orange, brown, you have to give that a lot of exposure. If you give the landscape a lot of exposure, well then you've blown out the clouds in the sky. So there's no way to get clouds. Very, very rare instances will you have a cloud and a sky in a printable negative. That's the key, is it printable? Not just something you can see, but will it make a good photographic print? I have an example of one of the ways that clouds can be made. Nick, could you hand me that first negative? Thank you. It's like soupy sales. This is, actually, you know what? I'm going to put some gloves on for that. These are vintage negatives. They're in my collection, not the museum's, but still, put some gloves on. I don't want it to slip out of my hands. So here is a vintage wet collodion negative. You don't really see much as you see it here, but I'm going to put it onto the light table in a second. Before I do that, I want you to notice the back. The back of the negative has a piece of tissue paper glued to the edges of the glass plate. And on the tissue paper, there are smudges of charcoal. Sometimes they use graphite. In this case, it's charcoal. Let me put it on a light box so you can see what it looks like. Nick, can you switch me over to the next camera? Are we on that? Oh, she is. Okay. Good. This is all new to us, so bear with us. So here it is on the light table, and you can just barely see some elements of the image, but I'm going to turn it on with a rheostat. I'm going to bring it up slowly. Looks like it's focusing on it, but now you can see the building, and you can see the clouds. So all of this area here are charcoal clouds. The same technique could be applied to the actual negative. It could be painted on the negative. So you would paint it on the back side of the negative. And the reason for that is you don't want brushstrokes to show in the final print. And since these plates are used for contact printing, you want to soften the effect. And so they would put the clouds either directly on the back of the plate using paint, some kind of opaque paint or semi-opaque, or they would glue them to the back. Again, I'll show you the back of this plate by turning it over. This plate was made in the 1870s. And there you go. There is the back of the plate. Now this tissue paper has yellowed over time. When it was brand new, it was just like any other tissue paper. But over time, tissue paper is pretty poor quality, and it's turned yellow. But imagine this as just plain tissue paper. And I think we can agree that not a lot of effort was put into making these look like real clouds. What they're really doing is creating a disturbance, if you will. Let me put it back again. You can see it this way. There we go. And so this slight disturbance will show up in the final image as light and dark. And I think the impression is good enough for most people. At least it wouldn't have a blank sky. Now here's the thing. Actually, let's move this back. Can you go back to me again, please? And I'll hand this negative to Nick. When you're photographing in these old processes that are blue sensitive, an interesting thing happens. You would think that overexposing the sky would create a tremendous amount of density on the negative, where in fact it's actually the opposite. When you overexpose in the areas of the sky, what you're going to find is you're going to lose some density. So the sky doesn't ever really print as a white sky. It actually prints as a pretty horrible gray sky. And it gets worse. Well, worse for 19th century aesthetic. Today, people who use the wet collodium process love the artifacts. Okay, the process artifacts are anything that happens to the plate that you didn't expect. That is based on chemistry, based on your own handwork. If you put thumbprints everywhere, if you have a problem with getting the chemistry to work right, it'll create all sorts of streaks in the image. Now, those artifacts aren't seen very easily when you have a picture that has trees and landscape and grass and rocks and everything else. But they would photograph pretty easily and be seen easily in an area of one tonality, and particularly an area that doesn't have a lot of density. So here you have your landscape negative. The landscape came out fine. There may be bits of dust. There may be developer sweeps. There may be some things called oysters. And my favorite are things called comets. A comet is a little speck of dust that falls on the plate. And when you dip the plate into the silver bath, it creates a turbulence or a tail. And so they have a little central speck and they have a tail. So they look like celestial comets. You have to look really hard to see a comet where the landscape is. But in an area of one tonality, so the sky, that doesn't have a lot of density anyway, you're going to see them galore. They're going to be all over the place, particularly when you're working in the field, because you're working in dusty areas. And so the next step was to paint out the sky, to just get rid of the sky. And sometimes it's easy, sometimes not so easy. Nick, can you hand me the next negative, please? So here is a 19th century negative with sky retouching. Turn it like this, maybe you can see it off the shine of the light. This particular one is retouched with something called iron oxide. And again, if I put this on the light table, and here we go, we'll turn this on again. You will see a negative that shows a dwelling. These negatives, by the way, were from the Philadelphia area, just south of Philadelphia there. They were a set of 200 negatives that I found on eBay once. And they were all wet collodion, dry collodion, and handmade gelatin dry plates. So kind of a Rosetta Stone of the evolution of photography. They're great teaching tools. Something you should find. If you're interested in this, you should always find examples, just for your own reference. And so this negative shows that the sky is completely painted out. It's painted out on the, let me just check. This one is painted out on the glass side. Often they paint them out on the collodion side or the sensitive side, but this one's painted out on the glass side. And I think the reason for that is because it has so many trees in the picture. If you try to paint around every little leaf, and particularly if the leaves are moving, it's very difficult and it looks retouched. Whereas if you apply the retouching on the back of the glass, the thickness of the glass will diffuse that so that you can go around the leaves of the tree and be more successful in hiding the retouching. The best retouching is retouching you can't see. So that's the goal. There are times when you can't do this. Nick, would you hand me the next negative, please? These negatives were made by a man named Fox. He was a Quaker family in Philadelphia. It was a doctor. And as a young man, he made these negatives before he got into working in a hospital in Philadelphia. here's an example of a negative that shows a lot of trees, but notice that the trees don't have any leaves. This is an impossible negative to retouch. And so when you find a 19th century photograph that has a landscape where the trees have no leaves and they kind of feature these bare branches, you'll find that they are not retouched and often have a darker sky. That's the reason why they have a dark sky on this type of landscape photograph, because it's impossible to retouch. So again, all of these are very, very sharp. And there's so many of them that if you tried to paint it out, it would look horrible. It would not be successful at all. And so that's the way you would do that. Let me put this back, Nick. Now, there are other ways of trying to get the sky. No, not yet. And so you can go back to me. There we go. The other way of trying to get a sky in a photograph is to shade the sky while it's being exposed. So here is a 19th century lens used for landscape work. And what you would do is when the lens is on the camera, you would take a piece of cardboard or your hand, although cardboard is better. And during the exposure, you would just go like this to lessen the exposure where the sky was. It's not very easy to do. It's not all that successful. Here's another thing you would do. Here is an f-stop, or a stop, called the Waterhouse Tops. Usually they're round. For those of you who are photographers and use these old lenses, you know they're round holes. Well, this one has a hole that's triangular, and so it has the pointy part to the top. When you put it into the lens, that restricts the amount of light coming in through the top of the scene and gives you the full amount going off the bottom of the scene. And all of that is expected to give you more landscape exposure and less sky exposure in order to try to get a normal sky. And it's not very easy to do. So now, what I'm going to do is show you how to retouch a negative. And Nick, you can hand me that fourth negative. This is a negative I made. It was made in Norway during a workshop I taught. And I'm not going to do the whole thing because it's really hard to do this from an angle. Normally I would be doing this with a set of binocular magnifiers and put my face right up to it. But I'm just going to give you an idea of kind of what it looks like. The retouching that we're using, actually, could you go back to the long shot again for a second? There we go. The retouching we're using is made up of gum arabic dissolved in water. And I'm using graphite. So graphite and gum arabic. The other retouching that you saw in the antique negative was iron oxide. So iron oxide is, I guess the easiest way to think of it is rust. It's red. It's also called rouge. It's the same stuff that you put on your cheeks. It's the same stuff that's an abrasive that's used to polish daguerreotype plates. It has a lot of uses. In this particular case, you would mix it with gum arabic and water to taste. Don't taste it. As you need it. And it's like adding, how much cream do you add to your coffee? I can't give you a recipe, but you want to make it so it's dense enough that 2 brush strokes will cause the negative to be opaque, and it has to dry. If it takes too long to dry, it's a real pain in the neck, and it gets very goopy, and the retouching can sometimes stick to the printing paper. Today, what I'm using is the graphite retouching medium. And you can go to the close shot. So I'm just mixing a little bit of water with some retouching medium that I already used. The negative that I'm actually going to print from today is part of a set that I made 2 of them for the current show. The good one is on display, and this was the second that I'm going to be printing from. But this particular negative that I'm showing you is is actually just a spare negative I had from a trip. So it's applied like this. I mean, I want to brush it on, and it kind of, in the beginning, it will kind of beat up a little bit. You have to kind of work it into the plate. Now we're retouching on the varnished side of the plate, not the glass side. And when you want to do very close areas, of course, a smaller brush, whenever you have a building or man-made structure, you want to do this on the image side or the collodion side. In this case, it's actually varnished. So there I am. I'm going along the roof line right now. Like I said, I would normally have my face right in this with a magnifier, but you get the sense of it. There we go. So the roof line, I've done the roof line in a spot. I'll do the chimney. And the nice part about this is it's water soluble. So if you find that you don't like the look of it, you can wipe it off. In fact, Nick, can you grab me a damp paper towel and I'll show them that. There we go, all along the top. And generally, these negatives were not retouch the entire sky. Thanks. So let me just show you right down here. There's a spot that I just applied it roughly, and then just like that. It's water soluble. If you don't like what you did, you just wipe it off. Normally, I would just lick my finger and do this, but I know I'd get all sorts of comments if I do that. But what you do when the camera's not rolling. When you're working around the trees, one of the old tricks was to just take a finger. Never done this with a glove, but take a finger and just apply it like so. And you can see that it has a more mealy effect. Just right around where the leaves meet the sky, and then eventually you go, thicker up in the sky. But if you do that on both sides, that will allow you to have the effect of soft leaves rather than hard building. Now, once you would do the sky, they wouldn't do the entire sky with retouching medium. They would mostly do where they needed to, and then on the back side, the sky would have black cardboard glued where you wanted to cover up. So just a contour shape. In fact, Nick, if you hand me the negative I'm going to print from, that's the next negative. You can see that. No way I was going to be able to do this live, so I already retouched this negative yesterday. But there you go. There's, turn this down. There you can see the sky retouching, and it's all around all these buildings. This is a negative of the High Falls area in Rochester, so there's all sorts of municipal buildings. And then if I turn this over, you'll see on the back side what I have is black paper. And the black paper is just glued down with a few dots of gum arabic. In fact, I went over it again to do a little bit around a tree, and I found that I didn't cut the paper long enough, and so I just put a little piece of black tape. So all kinds of things. When you find antique negatives that have their original retouching, it's a great story that's told. I once was helping a historical society identify negatives, and when I got there, the people that were working, the volunteers that were working, were wiping off the retouching on the backs of the negative. They were just cleaning it with Windex. Don't do that. Try to keep those as pure as you can. All right. One of the other things you could do after you do the sky retouching, or sky masking, the real reason for masking out the sky, again, is so that you can put in a new sky. You can put in any sky you have. And so one way of doing that and was often done, is by drawing on tissue paper. So here's some tissue paper. Take off my gloves here. And here's some charcoal. Let me just go about this. And what I'm using is a stick of charcoal on tissue paper, and I'm going to do some cloud shapes. Thanks. And I'm going to smudge them so they blend a little bit. I'm just going to put a happy little cloud right here. And I'm going to blend in some of these. And what I'm doing is I'm actually looking for a highlight on the cloud. Remember that your landscape has a highlight, so your clouds also have to have highlights. What I'm going to do is when I get this done, which isn't going to take very long, what I want you to do is take your phone and take a picture when I put this up to the screen, and then you can invert it with your phone after the lecture's over. Put some cumulus clouds here. And little shadows. Again, the shadows are shadows, they're highlights actually, but because I'm looking at this, I'm thinking about this backwards, right? You're making a negative. I often thought it would be fun to just do a workshop where we draw clouds and make prints from the drawn clouds. When I had to do the one for the recent exhibit, Nick and I went down the High Falls and I photographed the falls, which was no problem. But then when I went to do the clouds, we had to wait 3 weeks until we saw clouds. Sometimes they don't play with you, right? They don't play fair. And so a photographer who would use clouds would stop everything. If they saw a day where there were good clouds, well, heck, they would stop everything and go out and photograph clouds. So here we go. This is a very stormy day in Rochester. So see if I can do this.
Do it to the camera over your shoulder.
Oh, right. Good idea. Let's see. Where is it? Yep. Is that good? That way?
More towards me. There you go.
Is that? Can you see that? Yeah. It's hard to see because the monitor has other pictures. But take a picture of that with your own phone. If I move it, it'll be even better. And then invert it when you have time. But that's what you would have as a cloud negative. And again, here we go. There, it's on a piece of translucent paper. If I put it on the stand, there we go. There's your cloud. And you know, people use these over and over again as well. If they like them, they kept them. This one is going to go in the trash cans. I'm going to put it over there. And the first thing I'm going to show you about the sky masking is how you would make an image using the sky masking in 3 different ways. So, Nick, would you hand me the small printing frame? And the landscape negative. For those of you who wear clatter rings, always turn them or you'll never get your gloves on. All right. And so make sure you put the negative in the correct way. So it's going to be sensitive side up or coated side up. And now the first sheet of paper in there is sensitive. Here's a sheet of albumin paper that I sensitized about 2 hours ago. And so here it is, and I'm handling it in the light, right? Well, albumin paper is a printing out paper, so we can handle this in a fair amount of light before it turns color. So what I'm going to do is put this in with a negative. And again, this is albumin paper. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's paper that has been floated on egg white, albumin. And the egg white has a chloride. Once the paper is floated on the albumin, it is dried, and then it's floated on silver nitrate. And so now you have a coating of silver chloride on the paper. So, you know, what you're seeing here, you don't really see anything yet, but bring me that light. Red here kind of leaked. All right, so here we have a light unit. If we're lucky, it'll work. Go ahead. All right. So this is a UV light. My preference would really be doing this outside, but you can't be carrying cameras back and forth. So it's printing a little bit. You can actually see on the outer edges, maybe. I'll show you. I'm going to print it a little bit so you can see how it prints. These printing out papers, well, the old term was called scotophorous. So anything that turns dark when light strikes it is scotophorous. But it's a printing paper that when light strikes the paper, it turns the silver chloride back to metallic silver, and that's dark. So this should be enough for me to show at least an image. So I'm going to move this along. Back again. I put these tables on rollers. Reminds me of that scene in Witness where the old Amish guy is going back and forth in the kitchen. All right, so what I will do, let me have this, you'll be able to see that in fact there is an image. You can see it's printing. But this image needs a lot more printing time. But that really didn't take very long. But let me just send this over to Nick. And Nick, I'm going to give you this. And you can take that out, put the good print in there as if we really did print it, right? Don't tell anybody. And so while it's printing, I'll just tell you a little bit about printing out papers. It's the oldest form of silver-based photography where silver nitrate, even if it's brushed on paper, the combination of silver and organic matter, paper, will print back to metallic silver. It also works really well on skin, on clothing, and everything your spouse holds dear. Floors, hair, everything. In photography, though, generally in printing, it's used with a chloride. So the first chloride is sodium chloride. Sodium chloride, does that look like it could have been printed on?
Oh, it's pretty great.
Oh, yeah, all right. That's just what I'm looking for. And so let's see what it looks like now that it has been printed. I'll check it and see if it needs more time. There we go. There is the scene. So I'm going to take it out of the printing frame. And just to be safe, I'm going to put that in there just as a place to store it. With that negative destroyed, you can put that anywhere. And here's the print. All right, so, there we go. See, there's the print of High Falls. There are a couple of places, like right here, where you can actually see some of the retouching came off and stuck to the paper. But this is not a bad thing. It doesn't hurt it. All we'd have to do is just take a little scraper and scrape that off. It's just stuck on there superficially. So now, I have my print. You know what, Nick? Can you take that negative out of the printing frame, and I'll put this print or take the negative out, and I'll put the print in because the paper's curly. So I guess the first thing is, yeah, you can give it to me. The first thing is, and I'm just going to hold it up from here. You don't have to do a close-up. We would be satisfied with this. Many 19th century prints look like this. They have a white sky, and then they have the landscape. So that's step number one. That's level number one, is just a white sky. But really, skies aren't really white. At their lightest, they always have some kind of a tint. And so what we can do is we can take the print like so. Then bring that in. And I need the black piece of paper that's on that table. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to print in what's called a gradient sky. And I think you can go to camera 2 on this. I don't know if it'll show it. Let's see. That is something like this. All right. And now what I'm going to do is take this piece of paper and I'm just going to burn in the sky. Like so. This was a very common technique in the 19th century just to give the effect of sky. People like Timothy O'Sullivan used it quite a lot. And that's all it took. Hey, you can pull that back. And I'll take this out. And there we go. There is a sky that has a gradient printed in the sky. You can see that. So it's better than just a white sky. And it gets lighter as it goes towards the horizon line, which is the way we see skies anyway. They are lighter toward the horizon line. So much aesthetically, much more pleasing than just a plain old white sky. The masked out white sky was very common in calotype negatives, paper negatives. Okay, let me take that. So we've painted out a sky. And once we have the sky painted out, well, you can do a gradient sky. So that's what I just did, gradient. So white sky, a gradient sky, or you can print in a sky. And so we made a paper negative, and the paper negative showed clouds. And so what you would do is print the landscape. You would then take the negative out and then apply your paper negative, and then you would also do that as a gradient. Did we throw that away? Maybe I should have printed from that. What, the paper negative? Yeah, let's try it. They're too big for this picture, but bring that piece of paper back, and it's already printed a little bit. Well, I'll give it a try. I might need some scissors now. Turns out Nick's doing the real work here. I'm just playing around. All right, so I didn't plan to do this, but what the heck. Those of you who have taken workshops here at the museum know that I have a pair of massive scissors that I like to use. And because I haven't been here for 3.5 months, I can't find my darn scissors. Just use these. Decide where I want those to be. All right. Now I'm going to put this in, and let me flip it around the other way. Be less detailed that way. Put this in, see what we get. I love the unscripted. Boy, is it going to be a dark sky. You know what I'm going to do with the, let's see, I have to do it the other way. I it the other way because the sun was shining the other direction. The question is, would you take a workshop in just drawing clouds? All right, bring that in. Let's try. All right, I'm going to do this a little darker because it's not white anymore, so we're going to have to be a little bit more aggressive. The clouds won't be white, but you'll get the idea. Again, I prefer to do this outside. And when I do this outside, I would do it in a shady area. You wouldn't do it in the bright sun. Look. All right, that's nifty. Go ahead. It's all magic, right? Here's some magic. And you can see that. Can you see that all right? Yeah, here's some clouds. So there you go. There's some clouds in the sky, right? So cloud negatives. And you can see that there's also a gradient. There's also a gradient there as well. Pretty neat. Now we can take those out of the way. Who eats this casserole, right? Okay. So now the question is, how do you photograph real clouds? Because, you know, we've shown a gradient sky, we've shown a blank white sky, and we're talking about actually having a second negative that's a real cloud negative. Didn't I just get finished saying that clouds and sky photograph the same value? Right. The real story is I make all this stuff up. What we can do is we can choose a sky, and you have to have the right kind of sky. Can we have the next slide, please? Hopefully it's clouds. Yeah, all right. I took this picture Sunday, and it's a great example of when you're not quite sure what you're going to get. Luckily, in this particular case, the clouds have shadows, right? So there's a darkness underneath the cloud that is, it's a gray color, but at least it's not blue. There's certainly blue sky. We can also see that it gets darker higher in the sky, and it gets lighter down towards the horizon line. But also notice that there's a field that's red. There is foliage or grasses, it looks like a fallow field to me, that is a very yellow green. And there's even a red roofed house somewhere on the left-hand side on the horizon line. I can't see it from here, but there's a lot of things there that won't photograph and things that will photograph. When I say won't photograph, the landscape will be very dark. On the negative, it will not have much density. The best way to photograph landscapes is actually to photograph them on a sunny day with the light striking the foliage at a 3/4 view, so a 3/4 angle. And that way you have a strong shadow on the side of each tree or each bush, and then you have a highlight on the other side. So that's what you're looking for when you're photographing a scene like this. But if I got the right exposure for the scene, I still would blow out the sky, and the sky and the clouds would photograph pretty much the same value. So what do? Well, if you still want to take this wouldn't be a good picture, but if you still want to take the picture of the landscape, you go ahead and take a picture of the landscape. But then you turn your lens toward the sky, and you do a sky exposure. So you take a picture of the sky and the clouds, but you take it very quickly. So sometimes it's all of 2 seconds. Sometimes it's as fast as you can take the lens cap off. And what you'll get is a thin negative, but it will show some of the clouds. You don't need a strong negative to print in the clouds. Remember what it looked like when I printed from the tissue paper. There was not a lot of density there, and yet it gave the impression of clouds, and actually a pretty good impression of clouds. Go to the next slide, please. Now this one I took a couple of weeks ago, and this was late in the day. If you're familiar with Legray's seascapes, these are the clouds that he used. Well, not the same clouds, but the same type of cloud. And so late in the day, two different things will happen. You can either get a pink sky with white clouds, or you can get a blue sky with pink clouds. So can you already guess how this would look in the final photograph? This would have dark clouds. The sky would be white, and the clouds would be very dark, approaching black, and very stormy looking. And so that's what Legray was looking for in his seascapes. For what we're doing, this would not be a good choice. We'd really have to wait for that time when the sky is pink and the clouds are white. Now, it's interesting, we had an unusual phenomenon once. Actually, you can go to the next slide. It's the last slide, I believe. Back in 1997, I think, my wife and I were shooting Collodion plates in Spain. And we came upon a town called Belchite. Belchite had been bombed by both sides during the Spanish Civil War. And for some reason, the road that we came in had no sign. We had no idea what this place was. And we went through a gate. We drove up to the gate, walked through the gate. And as we went deeper into this town, it was as if an earthquake or some horrible disaster had happened. Nothing was rebuilt. And the Spanish government kept it like this as a monument to the people who died in the Spanish Civil War. This was unbeknownst to us until we left the place and actually saw the sign on the other side of the town. Well, my wife took this collodion negative, wet collodion negative, of this scene. The plate was prepared and developed in the back of our car, in a box in the back of our car. And this was in an era when nobody was doing collodion on expeditions like this. So, we brought all of our own chemistry with us. When she came out of the back of the car and held up the plate, we noticed that there were clouds on the negative. And yet the exposure of the buildings was good enough. It was really hard to understand how this could happen. And actually, it wasn't until we got home and we were reading an article written by two Englishmen who were traveling in Spain in the 1860s who had the same phenomenon happen to them. As it turns out, the north of Africa has red dust that is cast into the sky over the Iberian Peninsula and casts essentially a big pink filter in the sky. It's not something you can see. We asked our Spanish friends, does this sound right to you? They said, yeah, actually there are times when your laundry comes out pink. And we had never heard of it before, and it's the only time it ever happened. But one thing I also want you to see is that this is the natural sky. It was burned in a little bit to accentuate it. But notice the little dots with the tails that look like bombs falling out of the sky. Those are comets. Before I mentioned that there are process artifacts that are common with the collodion process. And one is when a speck of dust lands on the wet plate, it can cast a tail behind that speck of dust when the plate is dipped into the silver bath or when developers float across the plate. When it's developer related, the comets have more than one tail. But if the tails all go one direction, it's from dipping the plate in the silver. And so this one shows the effect of developer sweeps and comets and other artifacts of the process, which in the 19th century would not have been embraced. I would say that most people would have painted out the sky on anything but this negative, and that's because of the clouds. It's a very, very rare image given the process that's used. Okay, we can go back again. And so what I'm going to do now is why you came here. I'm going to show how to make a combination print with a cloud negative. So Nick, can you bring the cloud negative in first? And I'll put it on the light table. Thank you. Here is the cloud negative that I made. And let's see which side is which. Put it on the light table. Bring it in. Can you give the camera two, please? That's the cloud negative. And it looks like it has a lot more density when you see it here on the screen. It just has to do with the light box I'm using. And the light box has a very warm cast to it. But this negative was all of 2 seconds. And I don't need much. I just need enough to make an image. You've already seen the negative that we use to make the landscape part of the print. And so now, what I'm going to do is get the larger printing frame. There are tables full of things that have numbers on them. Here's a much larger printing frame, and I need this. The reason I need this is that I'm not quite sure where I want to put the clouds. I have a choice. Could I have the paper, please, the last print? So here's a print. Again, I made this print about an hour and a half ago. And so there is a print with a white sky. Again, once we have masked out the negative, now we can take the white sky and do anything we want. And I'm going to lay down the negative. Make sure it's Collodion side up. And I'm going to lay print on top. Now, one thing about this is I can't really see where this is going to stay. And so what I'd like to do is turn it over and look at it before I print from it. This is really dangerous. When you put a plate in a much bigger printing frame, they can crack. So let's see. Yeah, I think I can do that. No, just a little bit more. I'll move it up a little bit. Again, because you are in control, you can put the negative anywhere you want. Down a little bit more. Every time I do this in a big printing frame, I just wait for the negative to make that horrible cracking sound. Okay. So I'm going to move this table out. And I need my black piece of paper for dodging and burning. Oh. Looks just like it. Thanks. All right. Now, I'm at a slight disadvantage here because it's hard for me to see what I'm doing at the same time. Say again?
Camera one looks good.
Was it? I'll do it this way right here. All right, so here what we're going to do is we're going to print in the sky. And again, I'm going to bring down.
Just cheat your head to the right way.
I'm going to stop right now. I have to check it because I can't really tell. Needs more. And I'm just, again, I'm making it stronger at the top and less strong as we get to the horizon line. Actually tilting the paper left to right too. I can also burn in parts of this. I can take the negative out and just burn in parts with my hand. That's pretty nice. Just a little bit more. I'm getting greedy. I want there to be a wow factor. Even though I won't be able to hear any of you say wow. Nick, will you say wow?
Sure thing.
Okay. Something very satisfying about this. And again, people who have taken our hands-on workshops, when we do negative workshops, sometimes we show this. We had a workshop scheduled for Sicily this year, and one of the things we were going to do in that workshop was include retouching, sky retouching, next year. All right. Okay, you can move the light table. Back. Give you the negative separately. I don't worry about touching negatives. These are varnished negatives, and actually even with bare hands, a varnished negative is pretty safe. And here we go. Here is, question is, can we get a good picture? There we go. There is a believable sky. Is that in focus, I think? Yeah, there's a believable sky from a sky that was photographed, let's see, that would be 2 or 3 weeks later than the actual landscape. Now, throughout this demonstration, I only printed these just so they look good on camera. When you're actually making an albumin print, you can go to the camera one. When you actually make an albumin print to complete with the final washing and the toning, you would print it much deeper. So this is really more of a proof. But there we go. Okay. So if there are any questions, I can tender answers to those questions. If not,
Great. We've got loads of questions for you, Mark.
oh, really? Oh my.
Thank you so much. And I'll let you know there are lots of oohs and ahs in the chat.
Oh, really? Oh, good. I didn't hear any of that.
You're getting a lot of virtual woes and wows, and very nice. So, was the emulsion's inability to record warm colors the main reason for hand coloring?
You mean hand coloring as of real colors on prints? Is that what the question's about? Because we're not doing any coloring here. So, what was the first part of the question again?
So was the emulsion's inability to record warm colors the main reason for hand coloring?
No, it's the main reason for retouching on the negative to make the skin appear lighter. Because without retouching the negative, you would find that the skin would always look darker, no matter who you are. Everybody photographs dark, except for my wife. She's Irish. She photographs lighter, but her freckles photograph dark. When it comes to actually hand coloring, that's a different issue. One of the talks I'm going to give later on, I believe it's the one in December, is all about retouching. So I'm going to be hand tinting a tintype. I'm going to show about airbrush and how the different retouching medium are made. But it's not really based on the sensitivity for using color. Sensitivity failure just makes everything look darker. What's the next question?
So we had 2 people asked a similar question, which is about the type of paper that you did the cloud drawing on. So the tissue paper, was it a specific type of paper?
I happen to have it. But any tissue paper will work. Now, this particular paper has a very fine tooth, so that when you use the charcoal on it, you don't see bumps. You don't see the hand of man so much. So it's a very smooth paper. But this is says Gateway Deluxe Tracing Vellum. And, you know, we're very indiscriminate when it comes to buying this. We just buy whatever the art store has.
So how much was the white sky an aesthetic preference, or was it related to laziness, expediency, inexperience, lack of skill?
Well, remember that photography went forward and made money because of portraiture, not so much because of landscape. It was very difficult to sell landscape photographs, but the working photographers sold portrait photographs daily. When it comes to doing landscapes, you have the professionals that were out there doing it for a specific reason. So they were hired, you know, either for surveys or government reasons. But then you also had very advanced amateurs. And remember, in the 19th century, the term amateur doesn't mean somebody who isn't good at what they do. It means somebody who loves what they do. And so a lot of the landscapes were done by amateurs. When it comes to the aesthetic choice, well, again, when you see an unretouched, unsky masked landscape, what you're going to see are all the drips and streaks and comets from what they used to call indelicate handling. And you're going to get a sky that's kind of muddy and dark. So I would say the aesthetic was, first of all, they didn't want to feature the things that went wrong with the process. It's something we actually embrace today because I think we feel it's more human. But in the 19th century, photography was art and science, and it leaned heavily on the science. They didn't want it to be artsy. They just wanted just a clean sky. Now, the choice between a clean white sky or white sky and a gradient, well, then you have people really thinking. Again, if you look at O'Sullivan's photographs, you often see these gradient skies, and other people as well. And then the next step to print in clouds, that's a lot more effort.
So what is the difference in retouching gelatin plates as opposed to collodion plates? Were they touched from the gloss side only, or with water insoluble medium?
Right. Again, we're going to do a whole lecture just on retouching, and there are differences in how gelatin plates and collodion plates are retouched. The one thing that would be in common is that whenever you need to gain density, water-soluble blockout, so gum arabic along with either red oxide, graphite. There was also a yellow oxide, by the way. I didn't mention that before, but every once in a while you see a 19th century negative where the skies are painted out yellow. That was really the same. The retouching that's different in gelatin negatives is when you remove density. Collodion negatives, the image layer is very thin, and it's very easy to scratch through the image area and just have clear on the negative. And this is the reason why collodion negatives are always varnished. Gelatin negatives were first varnished when they were first introduced, but then they realized they didn't have to. So now we don't varnish our Tri-X film or our Ilford film because the gelatin's pretty hard. You still have to be careful. But the retouching was applied the same way as collodion to add density, but to remove density, they actually etched gelatin films. And so they would use a fine powder and they would rub it, and it would actually wear away the gelatin layer. And since gelatin negatives actually have the silver that runs throughout the thickness of the gelatin, as opposed to collodion where it's only on the top layer, you could actually successfully shave away density in a gradient just by using an abrasive powder. That's a good question.
How does the UV light compare to the sun in terms of length of exposure? So what would the typical printing time be in bright sun?
Good question. Given a choice, we always prefer the sun. The sun prints much faster than any UV light we have. It's also full spectrum. It gives a slightly different picture. We like the look of the pictures better. One thing to consider is that while it will print faster, we always get better prints when we put tissue paper over the printing frame. Slowing down the printing by adding tissue paper gives us the ability to print the darkest parts of the picture first, and then we can print the lighter parts, which can come out very heavy if you print them too deeply. So we print with 1 to 5 sheets of tissue paper in the sun, and then we evaluate the dark areas. If the dark areas look good, then we start removing tissue paper, and that way we can then print in the highlights the way we like them. But the sun is always our preference. But we're in Rochester, and we give printing workshops in the winter, so we have to have UV boxes.
Great. So I think we're out of time. We've already gone a little bit over, but I just wanted to mention to everybody quickly that if you are interested in doing an online tutorial or learning more and chatting with Mark about any of these, there were a few questions up here where people wanted to kind of expand on things and really dive in deep. That's actually a great opportunity to do a virtual tutorial, a one-on-one consult with Mark or Nick. You can register for those or learn more about them by going to eastman.org/workshops.
That's right. We teach, a consultation is basically where we talk about theory and what you might need. And a tutorial is actually doing the process.
Yeah, so feel free to head to the website to fill out an interest form to learn more about this. You can also email workshops@eastman.org with any questions or comments. I've also recorded all of the questions that we didn't answer today, and we'll be sending a follow-up e-news within the next week. So if you want to follow up with more questions from that, we are happy to take them. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you so much to Mark for this amazing and fantastic presentation on clouds and combination printing. We hope that we see you on October 13th for our next talk. And yeah, again, thank you so much all for coming.